Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today I'm going to tell you all about World War II Tank Doctrines. First, let's understand what a tank doctrine actually is. So this is where we take the design of the tank and make it meet what we actually want it to do in the field during combat. So for example, if we want to win a war by conquering an enemy's capital, which is deep inside their territory, we need light tanks, or tanks that'll have thin armor and light weapons so they can go really fast. That would be our tank doctrine. Let's see how countries during World War II used their goals and their aims to design their own tank doctrines. The core of British tank doctrine during World War II rested on having two distinct tank categories. One would be the cruiser tanks, and one would be the infantry tanks. The cruiser tanks would sacrifice heavy weapons and heavy armor in order to have very high speeds. The benefit of this would be so that they could get to a battlefield very fast and scout out the terrain beforehand, and then after the battle, after they won, chasing the retreating enemies from the rear before they could outrun. This is really harkening back to the Napoleonic era, when the British cavalry would harass the enemy at all times before and after a battle. This is where we get to the distinct category of an infantry tank. These would be the heavy toe-to-toe fighters in the heat of a big battle. They would have heavy weapons and heavy armor, sacrificing speed to accomplish this. They would charge right at enemy fortifications and defensive lines, and the goal would be to bust right through so that the battle could be won. Now, there was a big problem with this design philosophy. You would have a bunch of light tanks who could get around super fast, but then once the fighting started, couldn't really do much because they were so indefensible. And then you had the actual fighting tanks that were too slow to even get to the battlefield. This caused the British a lot of problems and really hindered any tank combat at all for their country during the first part of World War II. It wasn't until later, when they developed better tanks that had a balance of both characteristics, that they really fought well. This is where we get to tanks like the Comet. The Comet wasn't designed until 1945, so it really didn't have much chance to see very much action by the end of World War II, but it was an excellent combination of armor, firepower, and maneuverability, and it even ended up serving for the country long into the Cold War in the 50s and 60s. The Soviet Union's tank doctrine in World War II was kind of like an army ant strategy. It was all about having swarms of attackers just wipe away the opponent. This is really reflected in their tank designs because they are always made really cheap, really poor quality, and usually they were only designed to last a month. They were assuming that most of their tanks in a battle would be destroyed anyway, and that was their purpose. The tank the Soviets relied on in the early war were the BT tanks. They were perfect examples of this army ant strategy because they were so small, so light, so easy to produce, and they could have a lot of them. However, once the battles started picking up, they realized that these tanks were way too poor quality to be anywhere near a battlefield. Once they were involved in the war, the Soviet Union switched nearly all of their tank production into one model, the T-34. This was basically an upsized version of the BT tanks. It would be really cheap, really easy to produce, and really bad in combat, but there would be enough of them to make a big difference. As Stalin is credited with saying, quantity has a quality all of its own. Now, if you look at the T-34 on paper, it honestly looks like the perfect tank design. It has really good armor thickness, a really good weapon, and it looks like it could go pretty fast too. However, this really isn't the case if you look at how they were actually manufactured and how they went into the battle. They were manufactured with really poor quality metal that was always very brittle and not good when hit by an enemy tank round. The cannon would shoot low velocity rounds, meaning that it would leave the barrel at a lot lower speed than any other tank would be firing it, which decreases the range and also decreases the destructive potential when it hits an enemy tank. Another thing to consider is that these tanks had almost no visibility. If you're sitting on the inside, you only have your one scope to see out, and there's not extra visual opticals like other tanks had. In addition, they didn't even have radios and intercoms to talk with other tanks, or even within the tank itself, so there was almost no communication. These things were terrible to fight in. Before World War II, there were actually cases where German engineers would go into the Soviet Union to work on tank designs with Soviet designers. So early on, German tanks looked pretty similar and even behaved pretty similar to Soviet tank doctrine. However, once the war started going on, the Germans branched in their own direction. This is a Panzer II, a perfect example of the light tanks that the Soviet Union used, like the BTs and the T-34s. It only took a three-man crew to operate and was very small, very lightly armored, and barely even had enough firepower to be called a tank. Once they took heavy losses in Poland and France, the Germans realized that these things could not be frontline combat vehicles. This is the Panzer IV. It is a very good tank. It has a good balance of armor, firepower, and mobility. It does have some flaws, as it would break down a little more frequently than you'd hope, but overall, it was a very good tank compared to any other tank that was around at its time. Now, if Germany would have stopped tank designs here and just started improving the Panzer IV and working with it and starting to really mass produce it, they could have had a really good situation with their tanks. But that's not what they did. Hitler encouraged the German tank design philosophy to start going towards heavier, bigger, more powerful. He wanted super tanks. And what he got was mixed results. Heavy tank designs like the Panther, the Tiger, the Mouse, and this, the King Tiger, were perfect examples that super tanks are not exactly the way to go, because even though in a battlefield they could take out 5 times, 7 times, sometimes even 9 times the amount of tanks that they would lose, they were really not worth it because they were so expensive to produce, so hard to transport towards the battlefield, and because of the complicated engineering of these vehicles, at any time, usually only 1 in 4 were actually ready for combat, while all the others needed maintenance. Now, you might ask, why did Germany let this happen? Why did they manufacture these tanks that kind of seem like a big waste of money? Well, the war was kind of favoring a tank doctrine like this, because this is when Germany was starting to lose the war, and the front lines were retreating, caving in on all ends, closer and closer to their home base. So, the tanks didn't need to travel very far. As long as they had tanks there ready to fight, it didn't really matter if they could be transported long distances or not, because they were defending the land that was right outside of the factories. So this is kind of where the tank doctrine part comes in, because it shows you that even though this kind of tank design wouldn't have worked for other countries, it worked for Germany because of their current situation. Now, the US has almost an exact opposite situation to Germany. It needs tanks that are as light as possible so that they can be transported all the way across an ocean that's thousands of miles long. And then, once they're there, they need to be powerful enough so as to not be a complete waste of transporting. Like a Soviet tank would not be worth sailing that whole distance for, because then it would just be destroyed. So the US needed to find a balance between being light enough to be transported easily, but being heavy enough to not be worthless once it got there. This is the Sherman tank. It was developed by the US just after the start of the war, and it was excellent for the purpose they needed it for. While it wasn't the most powerful tank in the world, nor was it even close to being that, it was perfect for the role of being transported across massive oceans in massive quantities and still being good enough to fight once it got there. It ended up being an awesome platform that it also sold through Lend-Lease programs to Britain, to Russia, to all sorts of other Allied powers during the war, and even to lots of countries after the war ended. So, as you can see, tank doctrine isn't exactly always about which tank has the most firepower or which tank has the most armor. It's about which tank is best for the situations it's in. What do you think? Which tanks had the best doctrine to fit the situation their country faced? Let me know down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and come back for later videos.